On April 30th, 1789, George Washington stood on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City and took the first presidential oath of office. The words he spoke that day were those written clearly in Article 2 of the new Constitution, which established the executive branch of the federal government. The rest of Article 2, however, is not so clear, and Washington became the first of many presidents accused of unconstitutional behavior. But what makes one person a strong president and another guilty of executive overreach? Which presidents have done the most to reshape the presidency? And have we given some presidents too much credit while forgetting the important contributions of others? On our first President's Day episode of The Road to Now, we get the answers to these questions and more in our conversation with one of our favorites, the host of My History Can Beat Up Your Politics podcast, Mr. Bruce Carlson.
I'm Bob Crawford.
And I'm Ben Sawyer, and this is The Road to Now. Well, Bob, it's President's Day, and we thought we should do something special for this occasion. I don't know. Is there anything more special than having on Bruce Carlson?
No, I can't think of anything more special than Bruce Carlson for President's Day. The only thing I could think of that would be more special is if I took my wife out to a nice dinner for President's Day, and Bruce Carlson was our waiter. That would be... just take it to the next level. We should get Bruce to start like a package deal where you get this romantic President's Day dinner, and then he comes to your table and just woos the both of you with beautiful soliloquies about the presidents.
Yeah, what I love is like Bob's default is that President's Day is a romantic holiday. You know how when you take your wife out on President's Day?
Well, we just had Valentine's Day, and it's this special day to let your lover know just what they mean to you. But it's also a power grab by the candy companies and the greeting card companies. We need something a little more pure, and I think if we kind of took a little bit of the emphasis off of Valentine's Day and we placed it onto President's Day, it might be a whole new thing.
Sponsored by Bob Crawford's President's Day cards.
It's a niche market. It's a niche market.
We should make some Road to Now President's Day cards. We should make our own. We should sell those. Romantic President's Day cards next year coming from the Road to Now.
Yes. Anyway, yeah, Bruce is the best. He is so well read. He must have a photographic memory because he can call these little anecdotes up about presidents just at will. God, so glad to know him. Yeah. And I've said before, I went to college with Bruce. I've seen him perform with his band at the Stockton Pub in Pomona, New Jersey, where we went to college together, and we were both a part of the WLFR radio station, and we traveled in the same circles. And to see what he's doing now is just very exciting for me, and I'm glad that we've been able to reunite after all these years, even though we didn't really know each other very well. So
the roads diverge and they come back together sometimes. So we hope you enjoy this interview with Bruce Carlson. Bruce Carlson, welcome back to The Road to Now.
Thanks very much. It's great to be back. It feels like just, having a cup of coffee with some old friends.
Well, Bruce, we really missed you, and we're really glad to have you back. And I got to say that this is an interview I don't prepare for at all.
Great.
Because I know I don't need to. All I need to just is sit here and bask in your collective knowledge of history and just be wooed by the melodious tones of your voice. So this is really just the best.
That's a lot to live up to, but sometimes I do feel a bit like, it's just from having done this podcast, My History Can Beat Up Your Politics, looking at the politics of today and applying history to it for about 10 years. Yeah, over time, I guess just like a good plumber, knows how to take care of plumbing, and a good exterminator knows how to deal with the termites, you sort of develop some knowledge of where things are in history and how to apply it.
Well, I consider you the Mel Torme of history podcasters.
That is about the best compliment I have ever received. Thank you. But I don't think I'll be singing. I don't think I'll be singing.
But I've heard you sing.
I do often. Once in a while there is a historical reason to put a song in because songs were important. Music was very important in politics, being that you didn't have TV or things like this, and very often they would use to ratify, I should say, the Constitution, to show support for it. You had several songs that went out there about federal mechanics, and I wish I had the melody in my head, but it is important.
Hey, Bruce, if you had to write a song about the first 3 weeks of the Trump administration, what would the title be?
Roll, roll, roll those executive orders.
It's a hit. You're the Woody Guthrie of the 21st century now. Well, my preparation for this episode, for this interview, came with I loved it because this morning I told my wife, I was like, I've got to go get prepared for this interview, and I just walked out on my back porch and listened to your most recent episode of My History Can Beat Up Your Politics, which I hadn't gotten to listen to yet, and I was like technically preparing. It was a nice way to prep.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
And also, I'm not in an airport this time, which is also better.
That does help. Yeah, it does help. Although I started to get used to the sounds in the background. I don't know. I almost miss it. Maybe it could be a regular feature or something.
Right. Well, I want to start off. You know what? Your song is perfect. I think to get into some of the questions we have, because this is our President's Day episode, and American political history like few do. And a lot of people right now, as you pointed out, are talking about how Donald Trump's use of executive orders is this exceptional thing. It's been 8 years since we've had a new president. So we lose that perspective, and we've had over 200 years of this country's history. How do you see it? How does President Trump's use of executive orders compare with other presidents early on in their term?
Well, certainly a good number of them in the early going, and there's certainly, probably more importantly, being highlighted more, whereas often executive orders are the exact opposite in that they're done and there's not much attention paid to them, and so we find out later, that this was done or that was done. This is there's a lot of a big show being made of it and alike. Executive power is one of those things I kind of compare it to the debt ceiling or deficit spending. It's like very much a way to render visible how people view politics with a bit of their own feelings and bias applied to it. So if executive power is always bad when it's not your guy, it's always good when it's your guy. People compared Lincoln to a dictator, George W. Bush to a dictator, President Obama to a dictator. In fact, I was looking at an old podcast, and just recently we were talking about executive orders they had to be defended, mostly from people who were, coming more from the GOP side, in that President Obama had started using them after his second term when he really, lost the Senate, started resorting to that, and so there's a lot of discussion about it. Now you see some of the same folks are seeing it as, wow, this is great, this guy's the new FDR and getting all this stuff done. So what was a horrible instrument is now used for getting stuff done. They're pretty simple. I mean, I always look at the executive order as just saying that the president, the Constitution reads that the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. Now, there's a lot of dispute about what exactly executive power is, but it's pretty clear that the framers understood that this is the kind of power that just cannot be handled by the legislative body, that they decided it just wasn't practical to have 435 people deciding every day-to-day matter. So that's where I see it, at least. And so if you're running the administration or running a government and running the departments, which since the first president, President Washington, he was very much decided president would be the one that would be running those departments, obviously nominating people, that's in the Constitution, but also with the ability, if he wished, to ask for their resignation. So there was a little dispute as to whether that would be Congress or presidents decided to be president. But how do you communicate with all of these departments? You got your Secretary of State, and so it pretty quickly got to written orders, and these are the executive orders. But in a sense, it's no different than if the president picked up the telephone and told an employee to do something. It's just a broadcast way, a more effective way, and a more permanent and documented way of making an executive action happen. Here's what it can't do, and this is why it might be scary to people if they don't understand it. It can't really change law that's not there. It can be overturned by a court decision or interpretation if the court feels that the president is using the executive power too broadly, or actually making original law through a document. And Congress can overturn the president if the Congress doesn't agree. And many of the executive orders you even see coming out have stipulations of, where the funding's available to the maximum extent possible, so they sound really good coming out. One thing to keep in mind is that I think one of the early executive orders of President Obama was January 22nd, 2009, was Guantanamo Bay prison must close. Well, that never happened throughout his entire 8-year presidency. So you can see where just because you issue one of these orders, there's still a whole series of steps that have to be taken. In terms of the number, if he continues at this pace, President Trump would be pretty far up there, because I believe we're only at about 276 for Obama. Reagan's in the 300s. FDR a little over 400. So the pace is there, but I wonder if it will continue at this pace throughout the entire presidency.
And this is one of the things that I think is worth pointing out, because one of the most commonly repeated mistruths I've heard over the last few years was, I don't know, our listeners have probably heard somebody say, Barack Obama has passed more executive orders than any president in American history. And you know what? He's wrapped up now, and you see that he has passed, on average per year, he passed fewer executive orders than any president since Grover Cleveland's first term. You know who passed the fewest, second fewest since then? George W. Bush. And before that, it kind of goes back, and I don't know, when you look at it, you can see that it's not a partisan thing, it seems like. It seems like the use of executive orders has been going down for well over 100 years. And I don't know, I think that's something worth pointing out, because a lot of times people have these things that Barack Obama had overstated the power of the president. Well, this argument doesn't really hold up.
Right, and this was said about many other presidents. The Emancipation Proclamation, in a sense, is a form of an executive order. So there you have a really powerful effect coming from an executive order, but it was something that was in the president's purview, because it applied to the zones in the South where the military had control, and it was emancipating slaves that were in that area of the South. That was under the president's control. What he couldn't do is abolish slavery in the nation through an executive order. And of course, he was called a demon and a dictator, and there's all kind of cartoons of a rather ugly-looking Lincoln with a big crown on his head and things like that.
We talked about FDR and his use of the executive order, and then how he came up against resistance from the Supreme Court on a lot of what he wanted to do on a lot of the New Deal. I could almost see President Trump looking to do something like FDR did as far as packing the court. I think FDR's attempt to pack the court is this great chapter in history that a lot of people don't know about. I don't think people even know about this. Bruce, can you kind of tell our listeners about when FDR tried to pack the Supreme Court in order to get the New Deal passed?
You might call it FDR's political Waterloo. It really was the moment. That and the purge of 38, where the president targeted Democrats in primaries, typically Southern conservative senators who he disagreed with, and ran candidates aligned with him. But that, and then also his attempt to enlarge the court in order to get more favorable decisions so that he would have a few more picks. And that was definitely the moment where a lot of people that otherwise really supported the New Deal and supported FDR joined with Republicans and Southern conservative Democrats that were already starting to build and not only block that plan, but also stop some of the momentum that he had. So there's certainly, it's an episode that demonstrates some of the limits to presidential power. And I think you are going to see this today, because if you have a president using the executive power. Then the other branch is the legislative branch, and they're on a lot of cases in agreement with the president. On some cases they won't be. So then it goes to the courts to decide, and if there is a stretch, then it's up to the courts to block an executive order and then either force him to revise it or go back to Congress and get new law that it'll either be written in a constitutional way or that the law will match the order of what they want to do. But if he stretches too far, it will be blocked by the courts. And I think you already can anticipate a lot of court activity from this president. There was a lot also during the Obama administration, as states were fighting various initiatives. So I think it's just something it may have been going on, will be more publicized. Just like I think the executive orders were always going on, he's doing a few more than others. But it's a really public use of the executive order. That kind of like media pool spray where you go bop, bop, bop with the picture of the executive order. Bop, bop, bop. It's an odd thing to highlight when you consider that just kind of like 3 years ago, there was a lot of decrying of the use of executive power. But that's always the case. Executive power is one of these things. I will tell you that during the Bush administration, there were Democrats attacking the concept of executive power, and the president was trying to extend that concept. During the Obama administration, there were Democrats defending executive power and what the power of a president versus Congress. So we do tend to, in our politics, change a bit depending on whether we trust or like the person in that office. Gerald Ford tells a great story because no one has more experience than him. He was literally grabbed from the Congress and brought into the executive branch. And he says, when I was a congressman, I always just used to look down Pennsylvania Avenue and says, why doesn't that president just understand? And then when he became president, he realized, why doesn't the Congress understand me? They don't know what I'm going through, so those are all interesting relationships, and it'll be fun, dramatic, sometimes frustrating to watch all of it. For some people it'll be exhilarating and a happy time if they like the things that are being done. For others it'll be frustrating because the one thing is you have a president who is not reticent. All right, he's pushing what he wants to do, what he feels he was elected to do, feels he has a mandate, and all of that. So it is lights, camera, action, and you'll watch all the branches do some interesting things in the coming months.
I think it's worth saying you got to be careful what you do if you're in Congress in your relationship with the president. These recent nominations for the cabinet, for the presidential cabinet, they're big problems for the Democrats because they changed the rules. It used to be take 60 senators to confirm cabinet pick, and the Democrats changed it to get around, the Republicans during Obama's administration. And now, they're fighting, as we record this, they're fighting for that 51st vote against Betsy DeVos. That wouldn't be an issue if they hadn't changed the rules.
Right. Cabinet nominees, much bigger fight than you've seen in the past over some of these nominees. Much smaller votes, say, for Rex Tillerson as Secretary of State than most Secretary of State appointments get. We did an episode fairly recently on cabinet rejections. They're very rare. The last one was John Tower, 1989. Very rare. Usually Congress, even when it's the opposite party, it's the Democrats and Reagan, it's the Republicans and Clinton, they usually give the president what they want. Here, I believe there's a feeling that, first of all, anytime you have a president elected with a minority of the vote, including Clinton had a lot of trouble starting out because he was elected with a minority of the vote. You're going to get a little less compliance from the other party because they're looking at it and saying, well, I know you're in the White House, but we got more popular votes, so my people who elect me in my state or district aren't going to give me a problem if I oppose this. So you have a little greater strength of opposition because it's certainly unprecedented to even come close to rejecting a cabinet nominee. Usually, the president has withdrew nominees in the past when they faced some possible rejection. That's happened. To actually have one come to a Senate vote and get rejected, very rare. 1989 is the last one, and there's not that many. In fact, most of them happened during John Tyler's term, where he unfortunately got into a squabble with Henry Clay and lost a number of his cabinet. But there again, it was a president that the opposition Whig Party felt that even though he ran as a Whig, he wasn't a real Whig. He was like a anti-Jacksonian Democrat, and they didn't like him, Tyler. So they were going to, especially Clay, going to show him who was boss. But it's rare, very rare. Coolidge had won. Eisenhower had won. Totally the result of the nominee that he picked for a cabinet position, kind of insulting a senator in the past, and so Senate got angry. They're not, where there's been rejections, there's not always great reason for it. Sometimes it's personal squabbles, but they're very few.
Well, if insulting a senator was kind of part of the calculus for this one, he wouldn't get any, I imagine, true. So something that Lincoln didn't have at his disposal, Grover Cleveland didn't have it, Gerald Ford didn't have it, FDR certainly didn't have it, is Twitter and social media. And this president uses it. And in some ways it's positive because this is a direct line of communication between him and the American people. But I think even his supporters would say sometimes he kind of says some crazy things on Twitter.
Well, Twitter has changed, and social media has changed a lot of things. You know, athletes are finding themselves in trouble much more quickly. People are losing jobs over Twitter. People are being kind of doxxed, or here's this person's address, go get them over Twitter. I mean, it's definitely added some things. There were some concerns about radio when it first came out, and all of these unlicensed broadcasting and people selling pharmaceuticals without any kind of real effect and getting money off it, and a lot of messages of either hate or just weirdness and just uncontrolled. And in the 20s, Herbert Hoover was, as Commerce Secretary, started regulating radio with the Radio Act 1927. It's a new form of communication, and it certainly is both something that we can laugh at, and I do sometimes when I read the president talking about Arnold Schwarzenegger and the ratings of a show that he used to be on instead of. So I look at it a couple of ways. One is, it is very much his fireside chat. All right, you're going to once in a while see Trump with one of those like camera right on him, talk with the American people. He doesn't have the warmth of a Reagan or a FDR where, or at least FDR with his voice, where that will be as successful. So this is so I look at it in one way with a little lens of history as, yes, it's this unique communication tool. When Hillary attacked him in the debate over using it, like at 3M, he's like, hey, it's a modern communication tool, and validating it in a way. So I get that. He can communicate with people directly. It has the instantaneous feature, so it's also it can get him into trouble too, but he seems to do so much of it that no one thing gets him into trouble yet. So I kind of think it's his fireside chat. It's also his jelly beans. It's also the thing that he likes to do. It's like Reagan, famously loved those jelly beans. And I also think of it this way, and this would be a good way, I think, for the media to start thinking about it. It's like a president who's both recording his diary and his thoughts and communicating at the same time. So like many presidents, Reagan was probably the last one, kept diaries so that later there would be something in history. Grant has a really good one. Carter kept some diaries that were put into bookkeeping faith. This is like a president who's being president and writing a public diary at the same time. And I think it might be a good way to approach this for voters and for senators and for the media is to, I don't want to say ignore the tweets, but stop thinking of every tweet he sends as a presidential communication, right? That's his...
Right, we don't have to respond to everything he says.
Right, follow the executive orders, follow the actions, follow the official statements that come out of the White House, but reacting to every tweet, because otherwise it's going to be a long, long couple of years here.
But it has changed our norms, right? He's changing our norms.
Yeah. No doubt. Although politics, one of my previous casts was about the Jacksonian days, and politics did have a scrappiness to it. I'm sure those who were alive during the time of either Andrew Jackson or Andrew Johnson even felt that the presidency had changed in a way that they either loved, if they liked that sort of thing, or they just couldn't stand. And when Andrew Johnson has a famous moment where he squares the circle, he goes out trying to win the midterms of 1866 and goes out and tries to campaign for people who will support him. And he just gets harassed and heckled, and he doesn't respond well. At one point, he yells back at his hecklers. At one point, he says, "Oh, I wish the bullet had hit me," instead of Lincoln, or "This is what I have to do because the bullet didn't hit me." I mean, it's just these horrible statements that he was issuing from the stump, and all of it's not recorded on Twitter, of course, and not recorded on TV, of course, but recorded by many reporters who were listening, writing it down, and it would show up in the opposition newspapers all over the country.
Never mind the fact that Johnson's first day in the executive branch during his swearing-in ceremony, he was very drunk, and it's like one of the funniest stories in American history that he gets up because he replaced Hannibal Hamlin as Lincoln's vice president during the second term. And when he got up, he had taken the train overnight from Nashville to D.C., and he felt bad, so he drank a couple of glasses of medicinal whiskey before the ceremony, got up to give a brief talk, and then started yelling at people in the audience, got a few people's names wrong, and then finally, when he took the vice presidential oath of office, he wrapped it up by saying, "I kissed this book in the face of our nation, the United States," and then leaned over and drunkenly kissed the Bible. That's a hell of a first day.
I mean, a hell of a first day. Yeah, he was, and he pushed the presidency to a new place. I think most people agree he wasn't one of our better presidents and didn't do a good job. But presidents do push the envelope. They push what is a presidency. And I was talking with someone else about this earlier. They're saying, well, it must be interesting doing history at this time because things are so different. But we should never use history as a box to keep the present in. It's just for comparison and contrast to what happened in the past and what might happen in the future, even if somebody's acting in a very different way. But we should never, I think, in using history, I've always said this in the program since I started 10 years ago, politics is always possible that there will be new things that occur that never occurred before. And history is only as useful as it serves the present.
So this administration has declared that the opposition is maybe, including the Democrats, is the press, is the media. Can you think of other examples where the executive branch has really taken on the press? I mean, this president recently said that any polls that show him losing in any way are fake. I mean, is there any equivalent to this that we've seen?
Not in such a public fashion, this war on the press, but certainly presidents and media have had their tension. And I think it changes when there actually is a media, right? It's very easy, and there's less tension when there isn't a media. Now, what do I mean by that? I think if you look at like Franklin Roosevelt, a lot of his success and his big media tool was newsreels. You go to a movie, you watch the president before your movie. Sometimes, this is how popular FDR was, people were going to the theater to watch nothing but the president speaking on newsreel. No media, no interference, no questioning like that. No, newspapers are where at that time there would be more questioning and editorial, and you had a lot of newspapers were Republican at the time because the newspaper tended to be, throughout a lot of American history, the most wealthiest person in the town would start the newspaper as a way of building commerce. Los Angeles Times starts this way, very conservative paper for a lot of its history. So presidents have had trouble with newspapers and the media Nixon is probably the culmination of this, where there is an enemies list, and he's writing notes to Haldeman, oh, the New York Times again, they're after us, don't give any quotes to this reporter anymore, or don't allow this person in the White House. So I think that definitely Nixon engaged in a hostile relationship with the media. First thing when the Watergate story comes out is they go right after those two reporters. Later had to apologize for it, but their first reaction was to go after the media. The Bush administration had its troubles. Obama was at war with Fox News at different times. So I think it has occurred. But yes, you're seeing a much more deliberative strategy here. And then also what you referenced is the kind of discussion of how knowledge is even created, or how knowledge is even decided on, what's true. The epistemology, you might say. It's what's true. How do we acquire knowledge? And he's fighting on that battle. So there's always with I think Trump and Sean Spicer, this whole administration, you're always going to see both the statement and the meta statement. It's like, I question the position, and I question your ability to even question my position as well. And like you say, it's like the media's lying, or they start the press conference with all the things the media got wrong. It's possible to do, I think, because of the modern communications and where we're at with so many sources.
Yeah, a lot of people have, especially this recent SNL episode where they had basically Steve Bannon played by the Grim Reaper. A lot of people have been kind of mocking Trump in a way, saying he's not in control of the administration, that Steve Bannon is. Are there examples in the past where there was at least some notable sentiment that the president himself wasn't actually running the show, that one of his key advisors was?
Throughout history, there have been a lot of presidential hands behind the president. Most recently, that never quite happened with President Obama. You always got the sense that whether you agreed with him or disagreed with him, it was pretty much President Obama's show. With George W. Bush, of course, there was allegations that either Dick Cheney or Karl Rove were influencing him, and Dick Cheney had a large role in the administration. A lot of it might have been overstated. I've seen accounts of that White House, and I've seen two different stories there. So that's still going to be something that's parsed out through history. But in the early going, a lot was ceded to Vice President Cheney. I've also seen people who have been in staff meetings or read where they said, "Are you kidding me? George W. Bush is the alpha male in the room. He was running that meeting." And certainly towards the end of his presidency, in this good Bob Woodward book about the end, when it started with the surge program in Iraq, that he took over more. If there had been a lot ceded to Cheney, he was definitely, George W. Bush was taking over more by the end there. But there's always these, Colonel House in Woodrow Wilson's administration was one of these kind of presidential hands that a lot of people felt were running things. The interesting thing was Colonel House was not too much of a public figure until the peace negotiations of World War I. So he was kind of behind the scenes and kept himself quiet, but people in Washington knew that House was running a lot of it. And for instance, when the president, right before his inauguration, if you wanted an appointment in the Wilson administration, you had better talk to his good Texas friend, Colonel House, and not to the official people who were running the administration and running the campaign. It was House's show, and then House ran his 1916 re-election and was very influential up until the time where they had a disagreement. And Wilson kind of banished him after the peace negotiations in World War I. It's very often one thinks of McKinley and Mark Hanna. Very often there's this kind of person behind the president, and how much of it is real or not is always subject to question.
And Steve Bannon was on the cover of Time.
Yeah, he was.
It's a little different this time because he also ran a media organization that he was very prominent in and very visible in. And he's been very vocal about his views for the past 10 years at least.
The presidency is interesting because it's one person. And because it's one person, and the framers of the convention did think about this, whether it should be multiple people or one. They decided on one. But when you have one, how the rest of it goes, you've vested the executive power in one person. How they do it can happen in any number of ways. Like Carter tried going with no chief of staff initially. It was like spokes of the wheel. Everybody can see me. It had to be changed over time. But initially, he wouldn't let. Ham Jordan wanted to do it, and eventually did kind of become the chief of staff. But he tried to go without that. Eisenhower was much more comfortable having come from the military. With you're not just going to walk in and see the president. You have to set up a meeting. There has to be an agenda, and all of this. So how a president uses the executive power, it's interesting, can change from person to person, and who they select as advisors are the people that are going to make them most comfortable. Like in the case of Colonel House, House hadn't delivered the goods. House wasn't the one that won the first election. There were other people. There, Tumulty, head of the Democratic Committee at the time, a young man who later got really mad at Wilson because of the role of House. But House was somebody that Wilson ate dinner with, felt comfortable, stayed at his house. He was close to William Jennings Bryan, who Wilson needed. So presidents tend to go to the person that makes them comfortable, because it really is one person with the power. I mean, that's you either love that. I saw somebody today say, "Saved by the bell, Trump's president, everything's great. We got saved as a country," or you hate it. There's this guy Bannon running the White House. So every president's a little different, but it is common that the titles of people do not indicate their importance in any White House.
Yeah, and as I was asking that question, it just occurred to me, Hamilton and Washington, the very first president. The people who opposed Washington said Hamilton's pulling all the strings.
And you look at Thomas Jefferson was Secretary of State, right? Secretary of State's in charge of foreign policy, in charge of relations with nations. Yet Hamilton and Washington come up with a executive order, really a proclamation of neutrality when war breaks out between England and France. All right, that wasn't done with Congress. It wasn't done with enough consultation, Jefferson felt, from him. Washington did run it by him, but the decision had largely been made. And there was definitely, Hamilton was a favored person. You wouldn't think of the Treasury Secretary as being the person nowadays in government that would be running things with the president, but he was favored in that administration.
Right. You just brought up a minute ago. You brought up William Jennings Bryan, and this slides into another question we had for you that I think he might be one of the answers to. We looked at this last election, and we saw that on paper, Hillary Clinton is perhaps one of the most qualified people to serve as president. She was in the Senate. She was Secretary of State, which is the highest post in the president's cabinet. She had all this experience, and as qualified as she was on paper, she turned out to be a pretty bad candidate. And after years of trying, 2008, and then she gets the nomination and she loses in this crazy election. Can you think of other people who, is this an anomaly, or are there other people who really were qualified that just couldn't pull it off?
Well, you have the great case of Henry Clay, who ran 3 times for the presidency, ran in 24 in that crazy election of that year, and probably didn't have much of a shot, but ran in order to become Secretary of State, perhaps, and then run later. He then runs against Jackson, gets the most votes in that election, but doesn't win because of a deal between Clay and Adams. Jackson becomes president later. Then Clay runs against Jackson in his 1832 re-election attempt and is unsuccessful because Jackson's popular enough. Then in what his big moment really seems to be would be 1844, where he runs against Polk, and people were saying, who is James Knox Polk, and that guy was Speaker of the House, so it wasn't exactly like he wasn't exactly a nobody, but no one knew his policies or anything, and there is an account that when Clay heard the name, everyone said, "Oh, you're going to beat this guy," and he said, "No, I'm going to lose because he's well known. I'm well known, and everyone knows my positions." And he tried to straddle on issues. So like with Texas being admitted to the Union or not, in the right audiences, Clay would say, "Well, I should like to see it." What does that mean? You're president. What do you mean you should like to see it? You're going to push for it or not? So I think that he was another candidate who just wasn't in the right place, right time, but had enormous skills and was a great senator and legislator and a person that wielded, a lot of power in Congress, and some of it good, some of it bad. He might have led to the type of consolidation in the House of Representatives that many of us don't like, the power being so much with the Speaker. But hey, he was an important figure and deserves credit and a lot of experience, and probably would have been a good president, but just couldn't be a good candidate. And he even lost not only elections but also nominating contests. So, for instance, there's a great moment where Henry Clay's on a steamboat and he walks right past Zachary Taylor, who's the president-elect, because he had never met the man. The Whigs go and nominate this general from the Mexican War instead of the great Henry Clay, and he gets to be president. So there's constantly this missing of the moment. And with Hillary Clinton, I believe, had she run, say, in 2004, or obviously if she had just done a little better in the primary of 2008, she might have been president. This didn't appear to be her moment. I wouldn't have predicted it. I probably predicted she was going to win the election, but certainly, I just think the time was different. People were looking for change. They were looking for more warmth, more connection, more. Warmth is the wrong word, but more connection, more real speak. This wasn't not an election of flowery language, the type of stuff that Bill Clinton traded on in 1992, and it worked really well. A new covenant. Well, there wasn't time for any kind of new covenant. Twitter's 140 characters, and that kind of thing. So, yeah, I think you've had candidates like that. William Jennings Bryan is a candidate who also ran 3 times. Thomas Dewey on the Republican side ran twice. There's another guy who had successfully fought the mob and the political rackets in New York City, and was governor of New York and well positioned. But there again, just they called him the man on the groom on the wedding cake. He had that mustache, and when he spoke, his voice was something like this. It almost sounded like you were opening a Broadway play. And even though people did talk differently in that time, they really didn't talk like that. And you compare it to Truman, who was doing, we're going to take it to these Republicans and make them like it. And that just kind of worked better in that election. So there was another guy who always seemed to be behind, but had 2 opportunities. And a lot of people in the Republican Party did like him. And a guy that I think actually would have been a pretty good president, Dewey. I don't think he would have been bad. He was a consensus builder and the like. In the Republican Party, he's a guy that later is going to try to stop Goldwater, and he's a guy that's going to oppose McCarthy and things like that. So there's some merit to Dewey. Bryan, I think, wrong place, wrong time. Again, 1896 came real close, really. A few votes in a couple states, and Bryan wins the thing. But after that, his runs after that were just not as good, and he started to lose some of that star power that he had in that first wild 1896 run.
It was that Cross of Gold speech.
Cross of Gold speech, which he gave again and again and again at every rail stop all over the nation. And he would use such fiery rhetoric, like, we're going to, you can burn your cities down, but you'll still have the farms, it's not a good idea running for president to talk about burning cities down, but, we talked about before, presidents kind of pushing the envelope, or candidates pushing the envelope, doing new things. That was certainly true in 96. And it certainly had the same effect. If you could measure unfavorables, what you had in Bryan was probably going on was a driving up of unfavorables, though they only started measuring that in 76. So in 1976, so obviously there was no unfavorable rating for William Jennings Bryan, but that's what was going on. He was scaring the other side with his populist rhetoric, even though he was energizing his own. And in Bryan's case, it wasn't enough. For Trump, it was. Bryan would have been a minority win as well. It would have been an electoral college win if it happened.
So crazy that, we think of this 2016 election, and it literally was, I think I heard 72,000 votes in 3 states, over 3 states that swung the election. Does that sound right?
Yeah, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And had Bryan won the way that he would have had to win, I don't recall the states. One of them's California, but it's a few states that could have turned the thing. More than 3, but a few states, a small amount of votes in a few states could have turned the thing. What Bryan was exactly the opposite of a coastal elite, if you will. He was someone who couldn't win the coast. His big problem was New York and New England, and where big money was, and they saw him coming and didn't like it, even Democrats.
So we, on President's Day, we think of Washington, we think of Lincoln, we think of these big-name presidents. But there are a lot of presidents. There have been 44 people to hold the office of the president. Who do you think is the most underrated president? Who's been left out that you think we should think about on President's Day?
William McKinley deserves more than he gets. Being on the $500 bill when it's not even in circulation anymore is no prize. The mountain in Alaska, we get it, but the mountain it lets you know that at one time he was an immensely popular president, and when he died, it was very similar to the John F. Kennedy experience. There were flags all over the nation. There was great mourning. He was very popular. He was seen as, whether right or wrong, we do assign presidents this responsibility for the economy, and the economy was so bad when he took office and so much better when he came out, and he was so associated with prosperity. Now, I don't believe that his actions really contributed to it, but in viewing the time, that's the way people felt. And also the growth of the country and the expansion, love it or hate it, into the Pacific, the Spanish-American War, the Philippines, Cuba, a new nation. In 1900, for the first time, there are U.S. troops launching an invasion in China to rescue missionaries there as part of an international operation. The nation changes under McKinley. And we just, at the time, his presidency was so important, and for many, many years after, he suffered from, it's like if you leave a job and a guy comes in and he's really good at it after you, they might forget you. And that's what happened. 1901, Theodore Roosevelt becomes president, and the memory of McKinley, I think, takes a hit. But people at the time, they liked Roosevelt, don't get me wrong, but they would have remembered McKinley very fondly. Do I get 2?
You get 2. Bruce, you get as many as you want.
I got to talk about my buddy Chester Arthur.
Oh.
What? Guy comes in as a crook, kind of the head of the collector at the customs port in New York City, which was just known as a graft, an engine for graft. That's all the excise revenue coming in, and it was well known that there was skimming and things like going there. Kind of a boss's man, very connected with Roscoe Conkling, the boss of New York. But when he gets to the presidency, he enacts civil service reform. He, as someone who benefited from the civil service system, knew exactly what was wrong, and reaches out to the opposition Democrats who had just won a midterm election and decides to work with them to pass civil service reform legislation. We don't think about how important that is. It was a big issue of those times. The federal government was so corrupt, and jobs were being bought and sold, and civil service under the Pendleton Act, George Pendleton, and signed by Chester Arthur, doesn't immediately change a lot. It's just a small amount of jobs, but it sets it rolling. And it begins the commission that later Theodore Roosevelt's going to serve on, Benjamin Harris's administration, and enlarge the activities of that commission. The beginnings happen under Chet Arthur, and not a lot of credit goes to him in history.
Well, on President's Day, we will raise a glass to William McKinley and Chester Arthur.
That's right.
I think that's a great idea.
We'll raise one for you too, Bruce. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks. Great to be here.
Thank you for joining us today on The Road to Now. Our program is produced by Bob Crawford, Ben Sawyer, and Ian Scotta. Edited by Nick Corrigan, Bob Crawford, and Ian Scotta. Paul DeFiglia provides our music. Please be sure to follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and rate us on iTunes. For more information about this or any other episode, please visit theroadtonow.com. For Dr. Ben Sawyer, this is Bob Crawford. Take care.